Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Tia Mitchell for one of our favorite episodes. It's the Monday Mailbag. Hey, Tia.
Hey, Greg. Today,
we're answering questions you called in or texted in to our 24-hour hotline at 770-810-5297. And of course, we're also answering questions you submitted via email to politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. Producer Shaney B. and his legion of interns has been pouring through all the questions. You've got them lined up. Shaney B., what do you got?
All right, let's start off with Judy in Carrollton, who writes, guys, you have to tell me about this Delta desk. Is there really a secret office that lets lawmakers cut the lines? Don't they have enough perks?
Yeah, this is a story. This is an interesting one that we broke on Politically Georgia's newsletter. What do you know about Delta desks?
So, and this one has really taken off. It has gone viral.
No pun intended.
This one definitely, and it's definitely struck a nerve. I will say this. It's not just members of Congress. If you've got enough money, you can also have your own dedicated, person to help you out at Delta, right? It's services they offer to elite members. Usually these are frequent flyers, meaning they spend a lot of money with Delta, which gives them access. Now, members of Congress, what makes them a little bit different is their access comes automatically by being a member of Congress, whereas you and me would have to spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to get that same access. That being said, most members of Congress, particularly from Georgia, where they're flying in and out of the Delta hub once a week, if not more frequently, probably spend the money that they would still qualify for the access. But that's kind of what Delta announced this week, is that instead of giving members of Congress automatic access to these elite services, they're going to not do some of the things they've been doing, like having a staffer meet you at the door and escorting you through security to your gate. But the phone line access, instead of having automatic access to the top level, they say members will have access based on their medallion status like a regular person. So if you qualify for platinum medallion status access because you fly frequently enough, that's what you get. But if you don't, and you have to just have regular access, then that's what you get. You don't get boosted up. So that's what's going on. The question will be, I think the question, or what I'm curious about, is how this will impact the service moving forward after the shutdown ends.
Yeah, Tia, we're already seeing it become something of a litmus test for candidates. On social media, we're seeing some candidates say, I will never use that even if they restore access. And, Derek Dooley's one who said Congress shouldn't have those types of perks. So it's really interesting to see exactly how that is moving forward.
Yeah. And I would say that, some of it makes sense. If you don't know what time you're voting, but you need to fly home because they're all being encouraged not to live in D.C. You want to live back at home. So sometimes they will book multiple flights to give themselves flexibility and of course the security of having these kind of high profile members of Congress navigating through busy airports. So I think there's going to have to be some give and take from members of Congress and the access they have, but also from members of the public understanding that they don't travel like a quote unquote normal person.
Yeah. Shaney B., what else we got?
Next is Jenna in Beaufort, who writes, what is Senator John Ossoff saying about this TSA funding mess? Is he feeling the pressure or is he pointing the finger at Republicans?
Tia, that is all yours.
Yeah, so I've been talking to Senator Ossoff a lot, of course, as the shutdown persists, as the lines in the airport grew longer, and of course, as the pressure on members of Congress to, figure out something is just increasing. Here's Ossoff responding to when I asked him how he reacts to being blamed for the problems at the airport.
That's politics. I want to get TSA workers paid and the traveling public moving safely and conveniently. Democrats have tried 8 times in the last 3 weeks to pass funding for TSA, and Republicans following the president's orders, have blocked it every time. We're going to continue working this week to get that TSA funding passed. And I hope Republicans will defy the president and instead join us in funding TSA.
And Greg, I'll say that since that, there's been at least one more vote. So at least 9 times Democrats have tried to fund TSA. Of course, Democrats have also rejected an offer from Republicans to fund TSA as part of a bigger funding package because Democrats say they still want more immigration reforms. So we'll see what happens.
Gotcha. I know we're watching that very closely. And as we're taping this at the end of the week, there might have even been more votes by the time you guys listen to this. Shani B., what else we got?
Next, we hear from Grace, a longtime listener from Atlanta. Grace writes, I keep up with Georgia's legislative session and have been hearing quite a bit around Senate Bill 214 and how it would affect Georgia's elections. I know it started out as a push for hand-counted paper ballots, but has turned into a more modified system to eliminate QR codes from the voting process. Could you all give us an explanation about the evolution of Senate Bill 214?
Yeah, this has been a fight, Tia, under the Gold Dome for years now, but this one is really prickly. It's been reshaped multiple times because lawmakers are scrambling to meet a pretty hard deadline. That's July of this year, when Georgia must stop using QR codes to count votes. Some are trying to push a much broader overhaul that critics say would cause lots of chaos at the polls because of the timing of all these changes, especially this close to the election. Interestingly, House Speaker John Burns told us he supports pushing back that July 2026 deadline and letting whoever succeeds Brad Raffensperger as Secretary of State work to hash out the details. We had State Representative Syra Draper, who's kind of like the House's Democratic go-to on voting laws. We had her explain to us this pressure.
Right now, there's a pretty simple plan on the books on the House side that would have us use the current system until 2028 and delay this prohibition of using the QR code for a few more years. That's probably the simplest solution, but it has not yet passed the House. It needs to pass the House, and then it would need to go back to the Senate for an agree or disagree before it could become law.
And here's Speaker Burns on this same bill.
Because of where we are in the process now and the time frame, we can have serious disruptions in our elections process if we don't handle this correctly. Now, we also believe that it's time for a commitment. We'll have a new Secretary of State, no doubt about that, come 2027. And that person needs to have an input into what this elections process is like. But one thing we want to do is we're going to set up an audit process that we will let the State Elections Board will be responsible for. They'll name the auditor. And we'll pay for that audit, and they'll audit the results come November.
So, Tia, as you can hear, this debate is still raging at the Capitol, but it looks like there's at least some consensus in the House about pushing back that deadline and letting the next Secretary of State and the next set of lawmakers who are coming in January figure out this heavy debate.
Yeah, and I wonder, Greg, how much of this is because, well, it sounds like the removal of the QR codes Republicans were willing to go along with, but they don't yet have the replacement in place. So it seems like they fixed a problem, based on a lot of concerns from Republicans about vote counting and concerns about voter fraud, but they didn't have a well thought out steps or what's next. Or is it just taking them longer to implement the next step?
That's the issue here, too, is that there are next steps, but there's a disagreement over what those next steps should be, with some in the Senate pushing for a complete overhaul, others a more modified overhaul, so much so that when the Senate plan came up for a vote a few days ago, it did not pass because there was Republicans who either walked out of the vote or ended up not supporting it. So big, heavy debate. And I think the answer we're starting to see come into clearer focus, which is delay the implementation, push back that mandate, and give lawmakers a little bit more breathing room to make these changes. But we do know that Democrats and Republicans are eager to make key changes to election law. Shani B., what else we got?
Jody in Dunwoody writes, I've heard you cite on multiple occasions that polling for the Democrats running for governor shows Keisha Lance Bottoms in the lead at 40%. I'm curious about the details of this polling.
Yeah, Tia, we always ask in our polls and the other sort of respected polls, credible polls that we see, that we use, that we cite, they tend to ask likely Democratic primary voters for the primary and likely voters for the general election when it comes to that point, right? So we're asking people who are telling pollsters they are likely to vote in the run-up to the May 19th primary.
Right. And also, just for people who are curious, and we partner with the University of Georgia, but they also don't ask the question, they don't put the names in the same order. It's randomized so that the person whose name is always first doesn't get, or alphabetical order or something that could give people extra leg up. Like if Bottoms is always the first person they ask, but so that's more randomized to make it a more scientific poll. I pulled up our poll. I think Jody was asking, it says, if the election to choose a Democratic candidate for governor were being held today, and the candidates were Keisha Lance Bottoms, Jeff Duncan, Jason Estevez, Derek Jackson, Rua Roman, and Michael Thurman, for whom would you vote for? That was the poll we conducted in October. I don't think we've had another one since then. But again, even the name order is switched up. Yeah.
And Tia, the 40% undecided, that's not an anomaly just in our poll. We've seen poll after poll after poll show a big chunk of Democratic voters, between 30 to 50%, are still undecided. And frankly, we've also seen that in other contests too. The Republican race for governor had a big number of undecided before Rick Jackson got in and started eating into that number. And also the Republican race for U.S. Senate to basically compete against John Ossoff, that has also had a number of undecided voters.
Right. And I do think for Democrats, what we're hearing more and more recently is because the Republican gubernatorial race is so much better financed, so they're on TV, they're attacking each other, that race is so high profile, Democrats are like, where are our candidates? We're not hearing anything from our candidates. What's going on? So I think there's so much more curiosity and a little bit of confusion from people who plan on voting in the Democratic primary, but still feel like they're not hearing much from the Democratic candidates for governor.
And I can tell you one reason why, $77 million, that's the amount that has been spent on TV ads and other airwave messages from the candidates for governor. Of that, all but about $1 million has been spent by Republicans. So that just shows you the imbalance. Really the bulk of the spending is on the Democratic side is from Jason Estevez, and that's about $1 million compared to $76.5 million for Republicans. So it is a astounding number. Shani B, let's take a quick break. Still to come, could we see ICE agents at the polls this November? And how do bills get fast-tracked at the legislature? This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. It's our Monday Mailbag episode, and Shani B has more questions for Tia Mitchell and I.
Okay, we've got a call from Carol who has a question about ICE.
I'm calling to find out if there are any plans that you know of to take care of any possible ICE representatives that plan to plant themselves at our polls where we vote. I'm very worried about that.
Tia, we've heard a lot from readers, listeners. We've heard a lot from Democratic politicians about this concern.
Yes, and I think that, of course, it's too early to say whether ICE is going to be dispatched to polls. What we've seen from the White House, from the Trump administration, is they wait for a crisis or their perception of a crisis and then say, we solve it by sending ICE agents in. Of course, that happened in different cities where they were doing immigration crackdowns, but more recently, of course, it happened with the long lines at the Atlanta airport. And literally, President Trump, over the weekend, put on social media he was sending in ICE, and they showed up on Monday. So I don't think this is something that they would kind of pre-plan, but if there are problems at polls in the primaries, maybe they could say that justifies considering sending in ICE. I do think if that were to happen, there would be legal challenges, particularly if ICE was dispatched to places with high immigrant populations where people would feel like that was something that could deter or disenfranchise people from voting. I could see that being a big issue of challenge. But again, I think it's too early. I think in Georgia, where we know President Trump is paying a lot of attention and has a lot of criticism of our elections, I think our local and state election leaders, quite frankly, are trying to dot all their I's, cross all their T's to have as smooth as possible elections in that May primary so that they don't give the federal government any reason to try to interfere.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, we don't know of any plans to put ICE agents at polling places. And if they showed up in a way that affects any voting, of course, that would likely be illegal. That doesn't discount fears from critics who say that their very presence, even outside of the range of lines for polls, or even the threat of their presence, could be intimidating for many voters. Cheney B, what else we got?
Next is Philip, who writes, I have a couple of questions regarding potential flaws in the Road to Housing bill. Question 1, does the bill cover the entities and their affiliates? And question 2, does the bill require entities which already own more than 350 rental homes to divest themselves of the excess homes over a period of time?
Philip, we've been covering this issue very closely at the AJC. We had basically a year-long series about housing issues in Georgia that helped prompt this bill, which caps large institutional investors at 350 single-family homes. But it's aimed at private equity firms and big investors who are buying up neighborhoods. But it's not really a blanket ban, and it comes with some big carve-outs and limitations that is worrying critics because they say that big companies could split their holdings across subsidiaries or other entities to stay under that 350 home cap on paper while secretly controlling more in reality. They say it's not really hard to get around those exceptions. They do say this is a good start. They do worry about all these carve-outs. It also doesn't impose a hard mandate that existing owners above 350 homes must immediately sell down. It encourages more of a gradual drawdown. So that's the basic situation for where this bill is. Again, supporters say there's some big holes in it, but they do say it's a good start. They also know that legislative focus is a hard thing to have, and they worry that this is their best shot at getting some more stringent protections. That's why they've been pushing for even more.
Right, Greg. And the other thing is we have to remember the crackdown on institutional investors is in the Senate version of the bill, not in the House version of the bills. So there's going to have to be a meeting of the minds if the House, which right now they don't want to accept the Senate version because of this language targeting institutional investors. So a big question is what's the final product? I will say in the bill that the Senate passed, it does say that a large institutional investor includes, limited partnerships, joint ventures, associations, or for-profit entities, whether they're working alone or in concert with one or more entities. So I think they tried to encompass as much as they could. But you're right. If companies say, "Oh, we've broken up," kind of the way the phone companies broke into Baby Bells when they were told they had gotten too big, maybe these big corporations do some paperwork and break up into smaller corporations. That being said, the 350 cap is still for these big corporations that own thousands of homes. Even if you break into very small ones, the 350 cap would still be there and could still have an effect. But again, it just depends on what the final bill looks like.
JB, what else we got?
Justin in Canton wrote in, some bills seem to move through the Capitol in just days, while others sit for weeks or never even get a vote. What determines which bills get fast-tracked and which ones stall out?
Justin, the mysteries of the Gold Dome. And Tia, you could answer this from a Washington perspective at the U.S. Capitol. But we talked to State Representative John Carson earlier, just a few days ago in Politically Georgia, who talked about how quickly his bill, which would suspend the state sales tax on gasoline products for 2 months. That was like a whirlwind. It moved through the session in just days. And of course, some bills don't just take weeks, they take months, they take years to get across the finish line. A lot of it matters who are the leaders and whether they're lining up behind it. If your bill is a House and Senate priority, or if your bill is a Governor Brian Kemp priority, it is in a pretty good spot. Does not mean it will pass, though, right? Even Kemp has had plenty of his priorities get waylaid or at least get watered down. And we certainly have seen how priorities for the Speaker of the House, John Burns, or for Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, how they've gotten tied up, even stuff that they, desperately want to pass. Literacy bill is a great example. That is the number one priority for House Speaker John Burns, but the Senate has its own ideas. And so everything that John Burns wants to get passed from that literacy overhaul will not end up in the final product. And, so the people matter, the urgency matters. And, that old saying, Tia, never let a good crisis go to waste. Crises, the urgency around what's happening outside the Capitol matters too, because that might be the best shot that lawmakers or that advocates have to pass X, Y, or Z bill.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Greg, and particularly when it comes to the leadership matters. Whoever's in charge really has leverage in concert with knowing what the other side wants. So it's not just what does the Senate want, but how does that mesh with what the House wants? To your point, like Speaker Burns' priority is on hold because the Senate knows how much he wants it.
That is,
and they're using it as leverage until the very end of the session.
Yeah, I had a wise lawmaker once tell me, never let them know what your priorities are. Like, there'd be a time when the late Speaker David Ralston would have a priority like that no one knew about. It was the 17th, bill on his sheet, but it was secretly one of his top priorities. Of course, with literacy, though, this is a common sense, common ground sort of issue, especially when we see in Alabama and Mississippi, states like that have passed their own literacy overhauls and seen really immediate successes from it. So leaders in the House didn't think this would be a political football. It is. Something will still pass this last week of the legislative session, but it will not be everything the Speaker wants, and it will not be everything the Lieutenant Governor and his Senate allies want either. So that is part of it as well. But you're right, Tia. Like, once it becomes someone's priority, it also becomes a political football. Jenny B., what else we got?
All right, next is Diane in Connolly. Why did Senator Matt Brass not let Senate Bill 339 be voted on? It was a bipartisan bill. It passed out of the Retirement Committee unanimously. It was listed 3 times on the agenda. How can one person stop a bill?
Jenny B., did you just do it on purpose? Because this is a perfect dovetail. Like, we talked about how things get fast-tracked, but also powerful people can block bills too without us even knowing it, right? Or at least with just whispers and rumors. We don't know if we don't know exactly Senator Brass and what he did behind the scenes on this measure. I haven't talked to him about it anytime recently, but we do know that if there's a bill out there that some powerful person does not want, they can do a lot to at least slow it down, to muddy it, to change it. House Speaker John Burns does not have a firm, basically everything that goes through the House, he at least has to let go through the House, right? And same thing with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. He might not have an opinion, a strong opinion on every piece of the dozens of the hundreds of pieces of bills that get passed or voted on every year, but he and his office at least have to let it go to the floor. And that you can say that the same thing with a lot of leaders in both chambers.
All right, let's do one more. We got time for Ryan in Lithia Springs, who writes, I'm a little confused about the partial government shutdown tied to immigration enforcement. Isn't ICE already funded through existing federal budgets? What exactly is Congress fighting over right now?
Tia Mitchell, this is made for you.
Yeah, they're basically fighting on whether ICE should get even more money. You're right. ICE has money through the One Big Beautiful Bill. They have money that could fund immigration enforcement and Border Patrol for several more years, but the Department of Homeland Security's full year budget is what is pending. It's the last of the 12 appropriations bills to be passed, still has not been passed as of this recording. And so Republicans are saying, we got to fund all agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, including ICE and Border Patrol. And Democrats are saying, we do not want to give ICE and Border Patrol any more money unless they address their enforcement policies, unless they wrestle with the fact that 2 Americans were killed during immigration raids. And that has been the impasse. Now, of course, as you know, the long lines at the airports and things like that have put so much attention on whether there should be some type of piecemeal plan where maybe you just fund TSA, or maybe you fund everything in the Department of Homeland Security except for ICE. Knowing that this is not really about defunding ICE. It's not about making ICE not operable. Even though Republicans may put it in that posture, that's not really the debate. The debate is about giving ICE more money within the Department of Homeland Security full-year funding bill, and Democrats have said we won't do it without policy changes.
And that is why Atlanta's airport has been at the center of a national political debate. And many of you who are waiting in those hours-long lines and those bottlenecks are also in the middle of that national debate. So whether you like it or not, you're part of the Washington back and forth. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you enjoy what you heard, please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform and share Politically Georgia with a friend. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.